The night Daniel Brooks became the most dangerous name in the Blood Palace. He was not holding a sword, a spell, or a royal invitation. He was holding a mop. At 5:43 in the morning, beneath the old Whitmore Museum in downtown Boston, the grand hall of the Ashbourne Blood Court had gone so silent that Daniel could hear cleaning water drip from the end of his mop onto the black marble floor. One drop, then another. Each tiny sound echoed beneath vaulted ceilings of red glass and carved stone, through a room filled with hundreds of pale vampire nobles who had forgotten how to breathe centuries ago and still somehow looked offended by the air he was taking up. Daniel stood in the center of the hall in a gray janitor uniform with his name stitched crookedly over the chest pocket, white skin made paler by the crimson lights, brown hair damp with sweat from pushing a cleaning cart through 3 underground levels, and a face that had spent years learning how not to react when powerful people looked through him. But nobody was looking through him now. They were all looking at his left hand. In it rested the black crown of Queen Victoria Ashbourne, a piece of ancient metal so dark it seemed to drink the light around it, set with deep red stones that pulsed softly against his palm like a second heartbeat. Daniel had found it less than an hour earlier in a place no noble had bothered to check, because nobles did not kneel beside floor drains, did not scrub silver dust out of grout lines, and did not notice what disappeared beneath their polished shoes. Now that same crown glowed in the hand of a human janitor who was only supposed to clean after the ceremony, keep his head down, and leave before sunrise. At the far end of the hall, Queen Victoria stood on the first step below her throne. She was tall, pale white, and still as a statue carved from moonlight, with long black hair falling over a midnight cloak and crimson eyes fixed on Daniel with something too controlled to be surprise and too sharp to be fear. She had no crown on her head. That was the problem. That was the reason the court had gathered like wolves dressed for a funeral. Lord Alaric Graves, the silver-haired noble standing nearest the throne, broke the silence first. His voice was smooth, formal, and cold enough to turn every word into a locked door. That human did not return the crown, he said. He activated it. A murmur moved through the court. Then, one by one, the oldest vampires in Boston lowered themselves to their knees on the wet marble Daniel had just cleaned. He stared at them, his mop slipping from his right hand and striking the floor with a sound that made the entire hall flinch. He wanted to explain that there had been a mistake. He wanted to say he was just the night janitor, that he had a sick younger sister in Lowell, overdue rent, and no interest in whatever royal nightmare had swallowed his shift. But before he could speak, the crown lifted from his palm by itself, turned slowly in the red dawn light, and bowed toward him. Queen Victoria's eyes widened the smallest amount. Alaric went pale in a way even vampires should not. And from every side of the hall, the blood court spoke in one voice Daniel would never forget. Chosen consort. 1 hour before the crown bowed to him, Daniel Brooks had been pushing a yellow cleaning cart through a hallway where every footstep sounded like an apology. The public tours of the Whitmore Museum ended at 8 o'clock in the evening, when families, college students, and tourists with lobster roll receipts in their pockets were guided back up to the Boston streets above. After that, the old brick museum locked its front doors, dimmed its exhibit lights, and became what it had always been beneath the marble floors and colonial portraits, the outer shell of the Ashbourne Blood Palace. Daniel had signed 3 non-disclosure agreements, passed 4 background checks, and accepted a night wage that was just high enough to make him ignore every instinct telling him to quit. He was 32, white, tired, and ordinary in the way men become ordinary when bills arrive faster than hope. His younger sister Emily had been in and out of hospitals since the spring, and every envelope from the insurance company felt heavier than the last. So Daniel cleaned where he was told to clean. He kept his eyes down. He wore the gray uniform, with Brooks stitched over the pocket. He pushed his cart past velvet ropes, black stone arches, and guards whose pale faces never changed expression. The rules were simple. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not touch anything marked with a crimson seal. Do not enter a royal corridor without a blue access tag. Never look directly into a noble's eyes for longer than 3 seconds. Most important of all, if a ceremony is taking place, become invisible. Daniel had become very good at invisible. He knew which marble floors streaked if the cleaning solution was too strong. He knew which staircases froze under the railings, even in July. He knew which vampires left silver dust on their shoes after meetings, and which ones dropped flower petals from court bouquets as if other people had been born to pick up beauty after it fell. That night, the palace felt different before anyone told him why. The crimson lamps along the service corridor burned lower than usual. The air smelled of candle smoke, old paper, and the sharp lemon cleaner Daniel had used on the East Gallery. Somewhere beyond the walls, bells rang 3 times, slow and deep, followed by a wave of whispering voices. Daniel stopped his cart beside a row of black statues and listened. 2 nobles swept past the end of the corridor, a man and a woman in formal dark clothing, both too elegant to notice the mop bucket beside them. "If the crown is not found before dawn," the woman whispered, "Victoria will no longer be queen." Daniel's hand tightened around the mop handle. The man answered without slowing, "That is the point. A throne cannot rest on sentiment. Ashbourne needs certainty." Their footsteps faded toward the throne wing, leaving Daniel with the quiet squeak of his cart wheels and a sentence he was absolutely not supposed to have heard. He should have turned around. He should have stayed in the employee corridor, cleaned the staff restrooms, signed out at 6 o'clock, and taken the first train back toward Lowell. Instead, he looked through the open archway leading into the old royal passage. The black marble floor beyond it was wet with tracked-in snow melt and scattered with pale flower petals from a ceremony that had apparently gone wrong. His radio clipped to his belt crackled. "Brooks," said the night supervisor, not quite human and never patient. "Throne approach needs cleanup. No questions. Move fast, keep your head down, and do not touch the red doors." "Understood," Daniel said. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. He pushed the cart into the forbidden wing because refusing a supervisor was a luxury for people without medical debt. The hallway stretched longer than any museum hallway should, lined with portraits of pale queens and kings who seemed to watch the floor instead of the visitor. Daniel kept his gaze where it belonged, on the marble, on the watermarks, on the thin trail of silver grit that ran along the base of the wall. The grit bothered him. It did not scatter like dust. It curved, as if something had been dragged or hidden near the drainage channel beneath the old statue at the corner. The statue showed a crowned woman holding both hands open, but the crown carved on her head had been scratched away by time or anger. Daniel knelt, not because he was brave, but because kneeling to clean was what nobody in that palace ever watched. His flashlight caught something red flickering under the drain cover. He reached for his screwdriver, loosened the small brass latch, and lifted the grate. Cold air breathed up from below. Beneath a layer of cloudy water and silver mud rested a black crown, untouched by dirt, its red stones glowing softly, as if it had been waiting for the only man in the palace whose job was to look down. Daniel did not reach into the drain at first. He crouched there in the forbidden corridor with one knee pressed against cold marble, his yellow cleaning cart behind him, his radio hissing softly at his belt, and the black crown glowing beneath 6 inches of cloudy water like a secret that had learned patience. Every rule he had signed said to step away. Every survival instinct he owned said to put the grate back, pretend he had seen nothing, and spend the rest of his shift cleaning restroom mirrors until sunrise. But the crown was not simply lying there. It was waiting. Daniel could feel that ridiculous thought form before he could. Stop it. The red stones did not flash or flare. They pulsed with a slow warmth, steady as a hand held out in the dark. He looked down the corridor. No one was coming. The portraits along the wall watched him with painted judgment. The scratched statue above him, the faceless queen with open hands, seemed to lean closer. Daniel swallowed, pulled a clean white rag from the cart, wrapped it around his fingers, and reached carefully into the drain. The water should have been freezing. Instead, the moment his hand closed around the crown, warmth spread through his palm and up his wrist, not burning, not painful, but startlingly human, like touching a mug of coffee someone had just poured for him on a bad morning. He lifted it slowly. Silver mud slid off the black metal in clean lines, refusing to cling. The crown looked ancient and impossibly delicate, shaped like thorned branches bending into a circle, yet it weighed less than he expected, and more than any object had a right to weigh at the same time. Daniel set it on the folded rag across his palms and stared. "Nope," he whispered. "Absolutely not." The crown answered without sound. Not a voice in the hallway, not words in his ears, but a sentence pressed gently into the center of his thoughts, so clear that Daniel nearly dropped it. Return me to the one who was never allowed to ask. He stepped back so fast his shoulder hit the cleaning cart. A spray bottle tipped over and rolled in a slow circle, the plastic click, click, click echoing down the corridor like tiny footsteps. Daniel looked at the crown, then at the drain, then at the access door behind him. I am a janitor, he said under his breath, because sometimes naming the truth was the only defense he had. I clean up after events. I do not participate in events. His radio crackled again. Brooks, status. Daniel grabbed it with a wet hand. Still working the throne approach. Do not linger. Court proceedings begin in 40 minutes. 40 minutes until dawn. 40 minutes until whatever happened to a queen without a crown. Daniel looked at the object in his hands and thought of Emily lying in a hospital bed in Lowell, teasing him for worrying too much while pretending not to worry herself. He thought of the envelope in his apartment drawer with final notice printed in red. He thought of what an object like this would be worth to people who bought history and sold power. A man with overdue rent could make a lot of bad decisions in 40 minutes. The crown warmed again, softer this time, as if it knew the shape of the temptation and did not judge him for feeling it. That was what frightened Daniel most. It did not command. It did not threaten. It simply waited to see what kind of man he was when nobody important was watching. He wrapped it fully in the white rag and tucked it carefully against his chest, under the gray jacket of his uniform. Then he put the drain cover back exactly as he had found it, wiped away the silver mud with a mop, and rolled his cart forward as if his heartbeat was not trying to climb out of his throat. The hallway opened into a balcony above the throne hall, and Daniel stopped in the shadow beside a red stone column. Below him, the court had gathered in full ceremony. Hundreds of vampire nobles stood in black and crimson, arranged by bloodline, rank, and 1,000 rules Daniel would never understand. At the center of it all stood Queen Victoria Ashbourne. She was pale white, tall, and motionless beneath the red glass ceiling, her long black hair falling over a midnight cloak embroidered with dark silver. Without the crown, she still looked more royal than anyone in the room. That made the empty space above her head feel less like absence and more like theft. Lord Alaric Graves stood a few steps below her, silver hair immaculate, formal coat perfect, his smile polite enough to hide a cage. The court requires certainty, he announced. A sovereign who cannot hold the blood crown cannot hold the blood palace. Daniel felt the wrapped crown grow warmer beneath his jacket. Victoria did not lower her eyes. The crown was lost, she said, calm as winter. My throne was not. The court murmured, and Alaric's smile sharpened. Daniel looked down at the marble floor he had cleaned, at the nobles who never looked at it, and understood something simple enough to be terrifying. Whoever had hidden the crown had counted on every powerful person searching high places, locked vaults, royal chambers, and sacred shelves. Nobody had counted on the man paid to scrub the drains. Then Alaric raised one gloved hand and ordered, seal every exit. Whoever holds the crown holds the future of this court. Daniel stood in the shadow with the future of the court wrapped in a janitor rag against his chest, and for the first time all night, being invisible felt like the most dangerous thing in the palace. Daniel had always believed there were two kinds of rooms in America. Rooms where people looked at you, and rooms where people looked past you. The Blood Palace throne hall was somehow both. From the balcony shadow, he watched Queen Victoria Ashbourne stand before a court that noticed every missing symbol on her body and ignored the woman inside it. She stood beneath the red glass ceiling with no crown, no visible ally, and no permission to appear tired. Her pale white face remained calm, her crimson eyes steady, her midnight cloak falling from her shoulders like a night sky sewn into fabric. Yet Daniel could see the space around her tightening. Not chains, not walls. Something worse. Procedure. Lord Alaric Graves moved down the throne steps with the measured elegance of a man performing concern for an audience. Your Majesty, he said, no one questions your history of service to this court. But a crown lost before dawn recognition creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is a luxury the Blood Palace cannot afford. Daniel's fingers closed around the wrapped crown beneath his uniform jacket. The metal warmed against the white rag, almost like a pulse answering a lie. Victoria looked at Alaric without blinking. You speak as though the crown walked away from me by choice. Objects do not walk, my queen. Alaric's smile stayed mild. They are guarded. They are kept. They are protected by those worthy of holding them. A few nobles lowered their eyes, not in shame, but in agreement carefully disguised as respect. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He knew that kind of politeness. He had heard doctors use it when telling his sister a treatment was too expensive to continue without approval. He had heard landlords use it when pretending eviction was merely a scheduling matter. It was the language of people who wanted their cruelty to sound administrative. Victoria took one step forward. The court shifted with her, as if every bloodline in the room had drawn a line only she could cross. Say what you came to say, Alaric. The silver-haired noble bowed. If the blood crown is not restored before first dawn bell, the council must invoke temporary stewardship for the stability of the palace, for the protection of human agreements, for the continuity of Ashbourne rule. And who would hold this temporary stewardship? Victoria asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. Daniel looked around the hall. The nobles stood arranged like a painting of loyalty, but every face pointed toward Alaric. Victoria saw it too. Something in her eyes cooled, not with surprise, but confirmation. She had known she was surrounded. She had simply forced them to admit it in public. Daniel's radio crackled softly at his belt, and he snapped one hand over it too late. The sound was small, but in that vast hall it might as well have been a dropped tray. A guard near the balcony turned his head. Daniel backed into the column's shadow, heart hammering. Below, Alaric lifted a hand. Search the service levels. Search every corridor. No one leaves until the crown is found. The word service hit Daniel harder than it should have. Service levels meant people like him. Cleaners, kitchen workers, maintenance staff. The invisible machinery beneath royal marble. If Alaric wanted a scapegoat, the palace had plenty of people no one important would defend. Daniel looked at Victoria again. She had not looked toward the balcony, yet somehow he felt she knew someone unseen was listening. Her voice rang through the hall, controlled and sharp. No human worker will be detained without my order. Alaric turned toward her slowly. A generous instinct, my queen. But generosity may be exactly what has endangered us. That did it. Not loudly. Not heroically. Something in Daniel simply stopped moving backward. He had been told for months to keep his head down, but head down was how he had found the crown. Head down was how he had seen the silver mud. Head down was how he had learned that people who never looked at the floor missed what held them up. He pulled the crown from inside his jacket, still wrapped in the clean white rag, and stepped out from behind the red stone column. Excuse me, he called, his voice cracking across the hall. Hundreds of pale faces lifted. The guards froze. Alaric turned. Victoria finally looked directly at him, and Daniel nearly lost his nerve under the force of those crimson eyes. She was not pleading. She was measuring him, not as a servant, not as an intruder, but as a man making a choice. Daniel started down the balcony stairs. Each step rang too loudly. His cleaning shoes squeaked once on the polished stone, humiliatingly normal in a room full of ancient power. He kept both hands visible, the crown resting on the rag like something sacred he refused to pretend was his. A young noble laughed under his breath. Someone whispered, "The janitor?" Daniel reached the bottom step and walked onto the black marble floor he had cleaned less than an hour ago. His mop bucket stood near the archway, abandoned and ridiculous. He passed it without looking back. Alaric's eyes sharpened. "Human, stop where you are." Daniel stopped 3 yards from the throne steps, not because Alaric told him to, but because any closer felt like taking something he had no right to take. He lifted the crown slightly, palms open beneath the cloth. "I found something that does not belong to me." The hall changed. Every whisper died. The red stones in the crown brightened, casting soft crimson light over Daniel's hands. Victoria's gaze moved from the crown to his face, and for the first time, Daniel saw a crack in the queen's perfect stillness. Not weakness, recognition. Alaric stepped forward. "Give it to me." Daniel looked at him, then at Victoria, then at the crown that had warmed in his hands, and asked to be returned to the one who had never been allowed to ask. "No," Daniel said, surprised by how steady the word sounded. "It belongs to her." For a moment after Daniel said it, nobody in the throne hall seemed to understand that a janitor had refused a lord. The red glass ceiling held the last darkness before dawn. The black marble floor reflected every pale face, every formal coat, every silent guard, and Daniel Brooks standing in the middle of it all with wet cleaning shoes, a gray uniform, and the blood crown resting on a white rag in his hands. Lord Alaric Graves looked at him as if Daniel had spoken in the wrong language. "You do not understand what you are carrying," Alaric said. Daniel kept his eyes on Queen Victoria because looking at Alaric made the room feel smaller. "I understand it is not yours." A breathless murmur rolled through the court. Somewhere behind Daniel, his mop bucket clicked softly as the water settled. It was the most ordinary sound in the world, and somehow it gave him enough courage to take another step forward. 2 guards moved at once, but Victoria lifted one pale hand. They stopped before their boots fully left the floor. That single gesture reminded everyone in the room, including Daniel, that the queen without a crown was still the queen. Victoria's crimson eyes rested on the wrapped crown, then on Daniel's face. "What is your name?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but beneath it Daniel heard something carefully hidden, something that made him think of a person standing in a locked room and hearing a key turn from the other side. "Daniel Brooks, Your Majesty." He almost added night maintenance, then decided she already knew exactly what he looked like. Alaric stepped closer, the polished heel of his boot sounding against the marble. "Daniel Brooks, you have entered a sovereign proceeding carrying royal property. If you were wise, you would place the crown in my custody and kneel." Daniel glanced at the vampire nobles lining both sides of the hall. Some looked amused. Some looked insulted. A few looked frightened, which made him far more nervous than the insulted ones. He thought of his sister Emily, of hospital bracelets and vending machine dinners, of every person who had ever told him that being careful was the same as being safe. Then he thought of the crown whispering inside his head, not ordering, not promising, only asking to be returned to someone who had never been allowed to ask. "I am not here to keep it," Daniel said. "I am not here to sell it. I am not here to ask for anything. I found it somewhere it should not have been, and I am giving it back to the person it belongs to." He walked the last 3 yards to the throne steps. Every inch felt longer than the Green Line commute after midnight. The crown grew warmer with each step, and the red stones brightened until Daniel could see his own fingers glowing through the clean rag. Victoria did not reach for it at first. She looked at Daniel with a strange intensity, as if the simple act of handing something back had become more dangerous than stealing it. "Do you know what it means?" she asked softly. "To return a royal crown in front of the blood court?" Daniel swallowed. "No, ma'am." A few nobles made a sound at the word, offended by how human it was. Victoria's mouth barely moved, not a smile, but something close to surprise. "Then why do it?" Daniel looked down at the crown. Its dark metal had no mud left on it now. Not one spot. "Because if someone took something from my sister when she was too tired to fight for it, I would hope somebody in the room would stop pretending they did not see." The hall went quiet in a different way, not shocked, listening. Daniel lifted the crown higher, palms open, arms steady only because he refused to let them shake. "This belongs to you." Victoria extended both hands. The sleeves of her midnight cloak slid back just enough to reveal pale wrists marked with thin crimson lines of old royal sigils. The crown hovered an inch above the rag before her fingers touched it. Daniel let go, or tried to. The crown did not move to her. It remained suspended between them, spinning slowly in the air, its thorns unfolding into rings of red light. Daniel stepped back in alarm, but the light followed his wrist, circling at once like a bracelet made of dawn seen through blood-colored glass. The entire court reacted at once. Nobles drew in sharp breaths. Guards lowered their ceremonial staffs. Alaric's face lost its perfect calm. Victoria's eyes widened, and this time she did not hide it. "Daniel," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Step back." He did. The crown followed him half an inch, then stopped, floating exactly between the human janitor and the vampire queen. The rag slipped from Daniel's hands and landed on the wet marble. The red mark around his wrist pulsed once. Every lamp in the hall bowed its flame toward him. Alaric stared at the mark as if it had ruined something he had spent years building. "Impossible," he whispered. Victoria looked at the crown, then at Daniel, and the loneliness in her expression sharpened into understanding. The court began to kneel, not gracefully, not willingly, but because something older than pride had pressed them down. Daniel stood frozen as hundreds of immortal nobles lowered their heads around him. Then Alaric's voice cut through the hall like polished ice. "If he is consort," he said, "then he can command her." Daniel Brooks had never been called consort before, but he understood a trap when someone tried to make it sound like an honor. The red mark around his wrist glowed softly in the throne hall, a perfect circle shaped like thorned metal, while the black crown hovered between him and Queen Victoria Ashbourne, as if waiting to see who would lie first. The court remained on one knee, not because they respected him. Daniel could tell that much from the fury in their pale faces, but because the old law had pushed them there against centuries of pride. Lord Alaric Graves stood at the front with his head bowed just enough to obey and his eyes raised just enough to keep threatening. "If he is consort," Alaric repeated, louder now, letting the words travel through every bloodline gathered under the red glass ceiling. "Then the human may speak for the queen. He may protect her from scandal. He may command her to step aside until the court is stable again." Victoria's expression did not change, but the air around her sharpened. Daniel looked from Alaric to the crown, then to the nobles kneeling on the wet black marble he had cleaned less than an hour ago. "That is not what I said," Daniel said. Alaric smiled. "You do not need to understand royal law to benefit from it." "Funny," Daniel answered, his voice still nervous but no longer small. "People keep telling me what I do not understand right before asking me to do something that helps them." A few nobles lifted their eyes. Victoria's crimson gaze moved to Daniel, and he could not read everything in it, but he saw warning there. Not for herself, for him. Alaric straightened slowly, as much as the old law allowed. "The crown chose you because you returned it. That gives you standing. Use that standing wisely. Tell Her Majesty that withdrawal is dignity. Tell her the court will honor her rest. Tell her a human scandal can be avoided." Daniel looked at Victoria. She stood tall, pale white and motionless beneath the suspended crown, but the loneliness around her had become painfully visible to him now. Not weakness, not helplessness. The loneliness of someone surrounded by people who had memorized every rule except how to ask what she wanted. "Do you want to step aside?" Daniel asked her. The court stirred at the directness of it. One noble hissed under her breath. Another whispered something about human manners. Victoria did not look at them. She looked only at Daniel. "No," she said. The answer settled into the hall like a clean line drawn across dirty glass. Daniel nodded once. "Then I am not saying it." Alaric's eyes hardened. A consort who cannot guide is useless. Daniel glanced down at his wrist, at the glowing mark he had not asked for and did not know how to remove. "Maybe I was not chosen to guide her." "Then why were you chosen?" Alaric demanded. Before Daniel could answer, the crown turned in the air. Its red stones brightened, and a ring of light spread outward across the marble floor, touching the knees of every noble, the base of every column, the hem of Victoria's midnight cloak, and the toes of Daniel's cheap cleaning shoes. The palace itself seemed to inhale. From the crown came no voice this time, but a memory, not seen fully, not shouted, just felt by everyone close enough to the throne. Daniel felt cold water around his hand again. He smelled lemon cleaner, silver mud, and old stone. He saw the drain beneath the scratched statue. He saw the crown hidden low where no noble would lower their gaze. Then the memory vanished. A stunned silence followed. Victoria turned toward Alaric. The crown required an outside witness. Her voice grew colder. Someone beyond court bargain, beyond bloodline pressure, beyond the reach of old family debt. Archivist Marin, an elderly vampire woman in a gray veil who had stood silent near the second row, lifted her head. "The Queen speaks truly. The chosen consort bond is not command. It is recognition of an unbought witness." Alaric's jaw tightened. Convenient interpretation. Marin's gaze lowered to Daniel's wrist. Ancient interpretation. Daniel breathed out slowly. He was beginning to understand the shape of the thing around him. The crown had not married him to Victoria. It had not made her his. It had made him impossible to ignore. A man with no bloodline, no office, no reason to protect a throne for profit, had returned what others had used as a weapon. That was why the court had to kneel. Not because he was powerful, but because his action had revealed what their power had tried to hide. Alaric changed tactics so smoothly Daniel almost admired it. "Then let the witness answer a simple question. Did you steal the crown?" The accusation hit the hall hard. Nobles straightened where they knelt. eager for a cleaner story. A human thief. A manipulated queen. A bond born from crime. Daniel felt the temperature of the room tilt against him. His mouth went dry. No, can you prove it? Alaric asked. Daniel looked down at the floor. The black marble still held faint streaks near the service arch. Thin traces of silver mud the mop had not caught. On the floating crown, caught deep between two thorned ridges, was the same pale residue from the drain. He remembered the brass latch, the strange rune engraved beside it. The way the cover had opened too easily after he loosened the screw, as if it had already been unlocked by someone with better access than a janitor. Daniel lifted his eyes to Alaric's hand. On the noble's right ring finger sat a silver ring marked with that same rune. Something in Daniel went still. He was scared. Of course he was scared, but he had cleaned enough messes to know when someone had dragged dirt across a room and expected the help to erase it. Actually, Daniel said, looking from the crown to Alaric's ring, I think I can. Daniel knew better than to point at a noble and accuse him in front of a room full of people who had spent centuries perfecting polite denial. So he did what he had always done when a mess looked too large to clean from the middle. He started at the floor. The blood court watched as he stepped away from the hovering crown and walked back across the black marble toward the service arch, his cheap cleaning shoes making soft squeaks on the damp stone. The red mark around his wrist glowed with each step, throwing a faint circle of light over the streaks left behind by his mop. Alaric gave a short, controlled laugh. Is the human leaving his own testimony? Daniel crouched beside the faint trail of silver mud near the base of the wall. No, he said, touching two fingers to the residue and lifting them so the court could see the pale shine. I am showing you where it started. A few nobles leaned forward. Most looked irritated that anything important might be happening below eye level. Daniel turned toward Archivist Marin. Is this silver mud common in the palace? The elderly vampire woman studied him, then looked to Victoria. The queen gave the smallest nod. Marin answered, only in royal drainage channels beneath sealed ceremonial spaces. It preserves old wards. No servant may open those channels without authorization. And a janitor? Daniel asked. A janitor may remove a public grate for cleaning, Marin said. Not a royal channel seal. Daniel nodded and walked to the scratched statue where he had found the crown. The court followed in a slow wave. Victoria first, then Marin, then the nobles who could not decide whether curiosity was beneath them. Alaric remained near the throne for 2 seconds too long before joining them. Daniel noticed. He hoped others did too. The statue stood in the corridor just outside the hall, its carved queen holding out both open hands, the crown on her head scratched away. Daniel knelt beside the drain and pointed to the small brass latch. When I found it, this was already loose. Alaric's voice came from behind him, smooth and cold. Convenient. Daniel looked over his shoulder. That is the thing about floors. They do not care what is convenient. The line surprised a few nobles into silence. Daniel lifted the grate, exposing the shallow channel below. The cloudy water had settled, but the silver mud remained along one side, pressed into a narrow, curved mark where the crown had rested. He held the floating crown near it without touching the water. The red stones brightened. The mark around his wrist pulsed. For an instant, the corridor filled with a reflection made of crimson light. A tall figure standing at the drain before the ceremony, one hand lowering the crown into the silver mud, a ring flashing as the latch sealed. The image was not detailed enough to show a face. It did not need to be. The ring was perfect. A silver band engraved with a narrow rune shaped like a hooked branch. Every eye in the corridor turned to Alaric's right hand. Alaric did not hide it. That was almost worse. He lifted his hand calmly, showing the ring as if it proved nothing. Many royal seals bear old branch work. Daniel stepped closer, holding up the crown. In one of its inner ridges, the same rune glowed faintly where silver mud had dried inside the metal. Maybe, Daniel said. But this mark is not decoration. It is a key print. The latch opened because it had already been keyed. I only loosened the cleaning screw. Marin moved with surprising speed for someone so old, bending close to examine the crown without touching it. The human is correct, she said. Her voice carried back into the throne hall. That is not grime. It is seal memory. A stir passed through the court, no longer amused, no longer dismissive. Victoria turned fully toward Alaric. The loneliness Daniel had seen in her before was still there, but now something sharper stood beside it. Authority. You hid the crown where no noble would look, she said. Then you ordered the service levels searched so the blame would fall on someone too powerless to answer. Alaric's pleasant mask finally cracked, not into rage, but into contempt. A janitor does not get to judge kings. Daniel looked at the mop bucket, the wet floor, the ancient crown, hovering beside him, and the queen who had been forced to defend her throne while everyone pretended theft was tradition. He was still afraid. His hands still shook. But fear and truth were not opposites. Sometimes fear was simply the cost of saying the true thing out loud. No, Daniel said. But he knows when someone tried to hide dirt under the floor. The crown rose higher, and the red glass ceiling answered with a soft dawn glow. The reflection spread across the corridor again, clearer this time. Alaric's hand, Alaric's ring, Alaric's cloak, the crown lowered into the drain. No blood, no battle, just an elegant crime performed in a place he believed no one important would ever kneel. The court fell silent as the image faded. One by one, nobles stepped away from Alaric, not dramatically, but carefully, as if distance itself had become a verdict. Victoria extended her hand, and the crown drifted back toward the throne hall, no longer between her and Daniel, but ahead of them both, leading the court toward judgment. The crown led them back into the throne hall as if the palace itself had changed its mind about who deserved to stand at the center of it. Daniel followed 3 steps behind Queen Victoria, still in his gray janitor uniform, still smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and silver mud, while the blood court returned in a silence that felt heavier than the bells before dawn. Lord Alaric Graves walked with them, but not among them anymore. The space around him had widened. Nobles who had spent the night leaning toward his authority now kept their hands folded and their eyes away from his ring, as if the reflection from the crown had made loyalty suddenly embarrassing. The black crown floated above the marble table below the throne, turning slowly in the red light. The mark around Daniel's wrist answered each rotation with a soft glow. It was beautiful, and Daniel hated how much attention it pulled toward him. He had spent years learning how to disappear in rooms like this. Now every vampire in the palace watched him as if the mop bucket had learned to speak ancient law. Alaric recovered first. Men like him always did. He stepped forward, bowed to Victoria with perfect form, then turned to the court. A seal memory proves mishandling, he said. It does not prove intent. More importantly, it does not remove the crisis before us. The crown has not returned to the queen. It has chosen a human consort. Therefore, the court must determine what authority that consort holds over the throne. Daniel felt the trap reset beneath his feet. Different words, same cage. Victoria's face remained calm, but he saw the flicker of exhaustion behind her crimson eyes. Alaric had lost the cleanest version of his plan, so he was reaching for the next one. If he could not make Daniel a thief, he would make him a master. If he could not prove Victoria unworthy alone, he would make her look ruled by the man who had found her crown. Archivist Marin stepped beside the marble table. The blood crown has recognized an outside witness. A witness with a bond, Alaric said. A bond to the sovereign is not a small matter. Let the human prove his loyalty to the stability of this court. Let him confirm that Queen Victoria remains fit to rule, or let him command her to withdraw until the stain of this scandal fades. The nobles murmured. Daniel understood the danger in the word command. He had heard people use one generous word to hide something ugly all night, but this one needed no disguise. Alaric wanted him to reach toward Victoria's power so the court could claim she had lost it. Daniel looked at the crown. It hovered close enough that the red stones reflected in his eyes. For a moment, he imagined how easy it would be to say the right political thing, to sound respectful, to let older and colder people handle what happened next. That was how people like him survived. They kept their names out of rooms where names became evidence. But then he saw Victoria standing on the first throne step, pale white and motionless under the dawn glass, surrounded by nobles waiting to see whether the man who returned her crown would now take the meaning of it from her. Daniel walked to the marble table. The court quieted. He lifted both hands, palms open, showing the glowing mark on his wrist, and nothing else. I need to make something clear, he said. His voice echoed upward, not polished, not royal, but steady enough. I did not come here with a claim. I did not return the crown so I could stand above anyone. I found it in a drain, wrapped it in a cleaning rag, and brought it back because it was not mine." Alaric's expression tightened. Humility is admirable, but irrelevant. "No," Daniel said, turning toward him. "It is the whole point." He looked back to the court. "You keep trying to decide what I can make her do. That tells me exactly what you think this bond is. But I am not here to give Queen Victoria permission to rule. I do not have that permission to give. I am not here to confirm she is fit, as if my opinion weighs more than her own crown. And I am definitely not here to command her to step away from something you try to steal from her." The red mark around his wrist brightened until the whole hall saw it. Daniel took one careful step away from the throne, away from the crown, away from any place that made him look like he owned the moment. "I returned what belonged to her. That is all. If your old law chose me, then let it choose the truth I actually brought with me. Her crown is hers. Her throne is hers. Her voice is hers. I am only the witness who saw someone try to hide that under the floor." The crown stopped spinning. For the first time since Daniel had lifted it from the drain, it moved without hesitation toward Victoria. No one spoke. No one breathed. Victoria stood perfectly still as the black crown rose before her, its thorned branches folding inward, its red stones warming from crimson to soft dawn gold. It lowered onto her head with the gentleness of something returning home. The mark around Daniel's wrist changed. The sharp circle softened into a thin line of light, no longer like a claim, but like an oath written around his skin. Archivist Marin lowered her head. "Witness consort," she said. "Not master, not owner, not ruler. The bond is complete." Across the hall, staffs lowered to the marble one by one. Nobles who had knelt to the crown now bowed to Victoria herself. Daniel looked at her, and she looked back with a kind of quiet gratitude that did not ask him for anything. Then Queen Victoria Ashbourne stepped down from the throne, crowned by her own right, and stood beside the human janitor who had refused to take even a shadow of it from her. For several long seconds after the crown settled on Queen Victoria Ashbourne's head, the Blood Palace seemed to remember what it had been built for. Not for councils, not for quiet theft disguised as tradition, not for noble families measuring power by how many invisible people they could step over. The red glass ceiling above the throne hall brightened with the first filtered light of dawn, and that light moved down the black pillars, across the wet marble, and into the crown itself until every crimson stone shone with a calm gold fire. Daniel Brooks stood beside the throne steps with his mop bucket still visible near the service arch, the mark around his wrist glowing softly like a promise written in light. He expected the court to shout, object, argue, anything. Instead, the oldest vampires in Boston lowered their ceremonial staffs to the floor, one after another, in a slow wave of public surrender. Archivist Marin stepped forward and opened an ancient black ledger that had appeared on the marble table as the crown completed its return. Her voice was thin, but it carried to every corner of the hall. "The blood crown has judged the matter. Daniel Brooks is not master of the sovereign, not owner of her crown, not claimant to her throne. He is witness consort, chosen because he returned stolen authority without bargain, demand, or fear of losing advantage. The bond is not command. It is testimony. So long as he bears the mark, no court may pretend the Queen's voice was absent while he stands to say he heard it." The explanation settled over Daniel with strange relief. The mark did not make Victoria his. It did not make him royal. It made him harder to erase. That was all the crown had needed from him. A person outside the bloodlines. A man with nothing to gain from palace politics. Someone who had looked down, found what powerful people had hidden, and brought it back without trying to take a piece of it. Lord Alaric Graves stood below the throne, still. Elegant, still pale, but now surrounded by silence that no longer belonged to him. Victoria turned to face him fully, and Daniel watched the entire court shift with her. This time, no one stepped between the Queen and her judgment. No advisor whispered in her ear. No noble tried to soften her words before she spoke them. "Alaric Graves," she said, her crown casting gold-red light across her pale face. "You hid the blood crown in a sealed royal channel, attempted to force Dawn's stewardship, accused an innocent human worker of theft, and tried to twist the consort bond into a leash for your queen. You mistook silence for weakness, service for invisibility, and law for a tool that would only fit your hand. Alaric bowed, but the movement had lost its power. I acted for stability. Victoria's eyes did not leave him. You acted because you believed a throne was easier to control than a woman wearing it. The words struck the hall harder than any raised weapon could have. Several nobles lowered their eyes. Others stepped farther away from Alaric, quietly withdrawing the last shelter of shared guilt. Victoria lifted one hand. By witness of the crown and by acknowledgement of the court, House Graves is removed from Dawn's stewardship, stripped of council vote, and barred from royal succession petitions for 100 years. You will leave the inner palace before the next bell, and every seal you placed on human service records will be reviewed by archivist Marin. No one applauded. No one needed to. The public silence was complete. Alaric's defeat was not dramatic. It was administrative, final, and humiliating in the exact language he had tried to use against her. Two court officials approached and guided him away through the side arch. He did not resist, because resisting would have made him look smaller than he already felt. When he was gone, Victoria turned not to the nobles, but to Daniel. That choice alone sent a visible shock through the hall. Queens did not address janitors before councils. Not in the old order. Victoria reached for the white cleaning rag that had carried her crown and lifted it from the marble where it had fallen. She held it beside the royal cloak at her wrist, clean cloth marked with silver mud, a piece of service raised into ceremony. Daniel Brooks, she said, loud enough for every worker hidden in every corridor to hear through the palace intercoms that had quietly awakened. You found what my court refused to see. You returned what you could have sold, hidden, or used. You stood before people who outranked you in every language of this palace and still said the simplest true thing. It was not yours. Daniel's throat tightened. He had been thanked before, usually by tired museum managers who needed him to cover another shift. This was different. This made every night of being unseen feel suddenly visible. Victoria stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance. The bond is complete, but it is not a chain. I release you from service to the blood crown. You may leave this palace, return to your sister, and no vampire under my rule will follow, threaten, or burden you. Your medical debts will be paid from the restitution fund taken from House Graves, not as purchase, but as damages owed to every human worker placed at risk by his accusation. You are free. The word free moved through Daniel more deeply than Chosen had. He saw his apartment, the train ride to Lowell, Emily laughing weakly while pretending not to be scared, the ordinary life he had nearly lost before sunrise. He could take the money, walk out, and spend the rest of his life trying to explain why red light sometimes circled his wrist in dreams. Victoria gave him that option in front of everyone. That was why he could trust the choice. Daniel looked at the gathered nobles, then at the service arch where two human cleaners stood frozen beside their cart, eyes wide, waiting to see whether one of their own would disappear back into the floor. He looked at Victoria, crowned now, no longer alone inside a room full of people. I will go see my sister, he said. But after that, I will come back. A murmur spread across the hall. Daniel lifted his marked wrist. Not because the crown owns me. Not because I know how to be royal. I do not. I am coming back because someone should keep looking at the places nobody important wants to look. Victoria's expression softened, not into dependence, but into respect. Then by my first decree restored under the blood crown, every human worker in this palace is named protected staff under royal law. No servant, cleaner, driver, nurse, clerk, or contractor will be detained, accused, or erased without direct crown review. Daniel Brooks will serve, by his own choice, as witness consort and oath-bearer for the lower halls. The shock finally broke into motion. Not rebellion. Recognition. Guards lowered their staffs. Nobles bowed first to Victoria, then, stiffly and unwillingly in some cases, to Daniel. Behind the service arch, the two cleaners slowly bowed too, but Victoria raised a hand toward them. Not to the floor, she said. Stand. They did. Daniel stood beside the vampire queen under the soft dawn glass, still in his gray uniform, crown light reflecting off the wet marble he had cleaned, while the entire blood palace learned that the man who looked down had changed the law for everyone beneath the throne.